My name is Diana. For 15 years, I carried a memory that felt less like a thought and more like a permanent scar on my soul. I used to believe that the day my daughter, Victoria, was born was the day my life ended. I was a woman broken in a hospital bed, discarded by the man I loved while I was still holding our miracle in my arms. But standing here today, I realized that the darkness wasn't a grave. It was a cocoon. Before I share with you how I turned those shards of betrayal into a crown of triumph, I want to pause and offer my most profound and humble gratitude to all of you. Your presence here is a sanctuary for me, and it is an honor to share my truth with such a compassionate community. If this journey of resilience and justice touches your heart today, I invite you to join our family by subscribing to Queen's Revenge. It is a place where we remind each other that no matter how hard you fall, you have the power to rise higher than those who pushed you. And to those of you who have already joined us, to our beautiful subscribers, thank you for standing by my side. I truly wish for your lives to be graced with overflowing abundance, that your wealth may grow as vast as your dreams, and that your hearts may always be full of a happiness that no one can ever take away. You are stronger than the people who tried to break you. You are the architect of your own destiny. Now let us dive into the day my world shattered, and my empire began. The air in the delivery room was thick, a cloying cocktail of antiseptic, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. Yet to me, it smelled like the very first breath of the universe. I lay there, my body a map of exhaustion, every nerve ending vibrating with the aftershocks of a 12-hour labor that had felt less like a medical process and more like a tectonic shift of my soul. The rhythmic, reassuring beep of the fetal monitor had been replaced by the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The raw, indignant cry of my daughter. Victoria! My victory! The nurses moved with a blurred, practiced efficiency, their voices a distant hum against the roar of my own heartbeat. When they finally placed her against my skin, the warmth was transformative. She was a tiny, wet, shivering miracle, a constellation of possibilities wrapped in a soft pink blanket. I looked down at her tuft of dark hair and those miniature fingers that instinctively found my own, and for a fleeting, shimmering second, I believed the world was perfect. I looked up, my eyes searching for Alex. I wanted to see the reflection of this divine joy in the man I had loved for 7 years. The man who had whispered promises of a shared future against my pregnant belly every night for 9 months. I expected to see tears, the kind of messy, unbridled emotion that follows the witnessing of a miracle. Instead, I found a statue. Alex stood at the foot of the bed, his silhouette sharp against the harsh, fluorescent glare of the hospital lights. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid, his face a mask of such profound, chilling detachment that the warmth of the baby against my chest seemed to evaporate. The silence that stretched between us was not the comfortable quiet of two people in awe. It was a chasm, widening with every passing second until I could almost hear the tectonic plates of our lives grinding together and snapping. Alex! I whispered, my voice cracked and frail, a ghost of the woman I had been just hours before. Look at her. She's perfect. He didn't look at the baby. His gaze remained fixed on me, but his eyes were no longer the warm, honeyed brown that had once been my sanctuary. They were glacial, two shards of flint that seemed to strike sparks of animosity against the very air. He didn't move toward us. He didn't reach out to touch the life we had supposedly created together. He simply stood there, an intruder in the most sacred moment of my life. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry the tremor of a new father. It was a cold, clinical rasp that cut through the room's lingering warmth like a scalpel. I've been through your phone, Diana, he said. The words were measured, dropped one by one like stones into a dark well. The confusion hit me first, a dizzying wave that made the room tilt. What? Alex, what are you talking about? We just had a daughter. Look at Victoria. I saw the messages, he interrupted, his voice rising only slightly, though the venom within it surged. The late-night check-ins. The guidance. The way you spoke to James Cooper. Your mentor. Do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think I haven't noticed the way you looked at him, the way you hung on every word of his career advice while you drifted further away from me? The absurdity of the accusation was so great it felt surreal. James Cooper was 60 years old, a man who had been a father figure to me when my own had died, a man who had helped me navigate the cutthroat corridors of Davidson Corp with nothing but professional integrity. Alex, you're exhausted. You're not thinking straight. He's a friend. He's a mentor. There is nothing. There is everything, he spat. And for a moment, the mask slipped, revealing a raw, ugly insecurity that had apparently been festering in the dark corners of his mind for months. He stepped closer, not to comfort me, but to loom over the bed. He looked down at Victoria then, and the expression on his face made my stomach heave. It wasn't hatred, it was worse. It was a total soul-deep rejection. He looked at her as if she were a blemish, a biological error, an inconvenient piece of evidence in a crime I hadn't committed. She doesn't look like me, Diana. She has your hair, your skin. But she has nothing of me. And now I know why. I tried to sit up, a sharp pain lancing through my abdomen, but I didn't care. I pulled Victoria closer, my arms trembling as I shielded her from his gaze. How can you say that? She's only minutes old. Alex, please don't do this. Not now. Not like this. I am doing exactly what needs to be done, he said, his voice dropping back into that terrifying, icy calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a printed transcript of a conversation he had stripped of context, a collection of innocent words he had twisted into a noose. He didn't hand it to me. He simply dropped it onto the sterile sheets of the hospital bed. It landed near Victoria's head, a piece of trash threatening my treasure. She's not mine. I know it, and deep down you know it too. The air left my lungs. The world didn't explode. It imploded. It collapsed into a single agonizing point of betrayal. I looked at the man I had married, the man I had built a home with, and realized I was looking at a complete stranger. The Alex I knew, the one who liked his coffee too sweet and cried at old movies, was gone, replaced by this hollowed-out vessel of suspicion and cruelty. He had allowed his mother's whispers and his own fragile ego to rewrite our history in the time it took for a child to be born. She is your daughter, Alex, I said, my voice suddenly steady, fueled by a primordial protective instinct that drowned out my own pain. If you walk out that door, you aren't just leaving me. You are abandoning your own blood because you are too much of a coward to trust the woman you swore to love. I don't have a daughter, he said. The finality in his tone was like a gavel striking a block. And I don't have a wife. I want neither of you. He turned on his heel. There was no hesitation, no backward glance, no flicker of the remorse that should have haunted a man committing such an atrocity. The sound that followed was what stayed with me for the next 15 years. It was the sound of his expensive leather shoes, the ones he'd bought for the promotion I'd helped him earn, squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was a rhythmic execution. Each step was a hammer blow against the foundation of our life, shattering the pictures on our walls, the memories of our wedding day, and the dreams of the family we were supposed to be. He reached the door, pushed it open, and the heavy pneumatic hinge sighed as it closed behind him, sealing me and my daughter into a new, terrifying reality. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the machines and Victoria's now quiet breathing. I looked down at her. This tiny, innocent soul who had been rejected by the very person who should have been her first hero. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, unaware that her world had just been halved. A single tear, hot and heavy, fell from my cheek and vanished into the folds of her pink blanket. I felt a hollow ache bloomed in the cavity of my chest, a phantom limb where my future used to be. The transition was instantaneous and agonizing. One moment I was a wife, a partner, a woman entering the pinnacle of her domestic happiness. The next, I was a casualty of a war I hadn't known I was fighting. But as I looked at Victoria, something else began to stir beneath the grief. It was a cold, white-hot spark of defiance. Alex Davidson thought he had left me with nothing. He thought he had discarded a burden. He was wrong. He had left me with the only thing that mattered, and in his cowardice, he had given me the greatest gift of all, the truth of who he really was. I held a miracle in my arms, but I was looking at a monster. Not in the room, but in the memory of the man who had just left. I leaned down and whispered into Victoria's ear, a vow that was etched into the marrow of my bones before the ink on her birth certificate was even dry. He will regret the day he turned his back on us, my love, because you are not a mistake. You are the storm that is going to change everything. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long bruised shadows across the hospital room. My life as I knew it was over, but as the darkness crept in, I realized that for the first time in years, I could see exactly where I was going. I was no longer Alex Davidson's wife. I was Victoria's mother. And that was more than enough. The night didn't descend. It collapsed, a heavy, suffocating shroud that smelled of floor wax and the fading scent of Alex's expensive cologne. In the interstitial hours between his departure and the dawn, the hospital room became a sterile vacuum where time ceased to function. Every beep of the intravenous pump was a metronome counting down the seconds of my old life, and every sharp, stinging tug of the stitches in my abdomen felt like a physical manifestation of my heart being haphazardly sewn back together. I lay there, paralyzed by a numbness that was more terrifying than the pain, staring at the clear plastic bassinet where Victoria lay. She was so still, a tiny island of peace in the middle of my wreckage. I wondered if she could feel the vibration of the world ending, or if the sheer force of my love was enough to insulate her from the radioactive fallout of her father's departure. The door creaked open, and for a frantic, delusional heartbeat, I thought he had come back. I thought he had realized the monstrous absurdity of his words, and was returning to beg for the privilege of holding his daughter. But the silhouette that stepped through was not Alex's broad, arrogant frame. It was Claire. My best friend didn't say a word. She didn't offer the hollow platitudes of "it'll be okay," or "he's just stressed." She simply walked to the side of my bed, took one look at my hollowed-out expression, and climbed into the narrow space beside me. She was a whirlwind of soft knit and familiar perfume, her presence a silent, fierce anchor in the rising tide of my despair. We sat there in the dim light, two women carved from different kinds of strength, while she held my hand with a grip so tight it felt like she was trying to fuse my shattered pieces back together by sheer will. "He's gone, Claire," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He didn't even look back." "Then he was never truly here, Diana," she replied, her voice a low, dangerous rumble of indignation. "A man who walks away from this miracle isn't a man. He's a ghost haunting a life he doesn't deserve." Later that night, Dr. Rebecca Chin entered. She was a woman who had spent 30 years witnessing the rawest moments of human existence, her face a map of navigated tragedies and hard-won triumphs. She didn't check my charts first, she checked my eyes. There was a quiet, steel-edged kindness in her gaze that told me she had seen this particular brand of cowardice before. She adjusted my pillows with a lingering touch that felt more like a benediction than a medical necessity. She spoke of healing, not just of the flesh but of the spirit, her words a quiet architecture of support. "The body remembers trauma, Mrs. Romano," she said softly, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "But the spirit has a much longer memory for survival. I have documented everything. The timing, his accusations, his abandonment. In this room you are not a victim. You are a mother. And that is the most powerful thing in the building." The true turning point, however, didn't come from a kind word or a supportive hand. It arrived at 3 a.m. in the form of a manila envelope, delivered by a night shift nurse who looked too tired to realize she was carrying a casket for my marriage. It was from Alex's personal attorney. Not even a day had passed, and the legal machinery of the Davidson family was already grinding my life into dust. I opened it with trembling fingers, Claire watching me like a hawk ready to strike. Inside were the divorce papers, cold and clinical, stripping away my name and my status with the efficiency of a butcher. And tucked between the pages was a check. I stared at the amount. It was substantial, a pity check designed to buy my silence and soothe his conscience. It was the price of his exit, a financial apology for the fact that he was leaving me to raise a bastard child, in the wake of his manufactured suspicions. It felt like a slap that left no bruise but set my entire soul on fire. In that moment something within me shifted. The numbness didn't break, it calcified. The soft, grieving woman who had entered this hospital wanting nothing more than a quiet life and a happy husband died in that bed. And in her place, something obsidian hard and dangerously sharp began to take shape. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply looked at the check, then at the signature, Alex Davidson. A name that now represented nothing more than a debt I intended to collect in full. "He thinks he can buy his way out of the wreckage," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, low, resonant, and devoid of the tremors that had plagued it hours ago. I didn't tear the check. I didn't burn it. I tucked it back into the envelope, a relic of his failure that I would keep as a reminder of exactly how much he thought my daughter's soul was worth. I looked over at Victoria. She had woken up, her dark eyes, those deep soulful pools that Alex had claimed weren't his, searching the shadows of the room. She didn't cry. She simply watched me, as if she were waiting for me to catch up to the reality she was already living. I reached out and touched her cheek, my skin finally warm again, fueled by a new cold-blooded purpose. I realized then that Alex hadn't just denied Victoria. He had underestimated me. He had seen a wife who supported his career, a woman who softened his edges, and he assumed that without him, I would simply evaporate into the ether of single motherhood and struggle. "You won't just have a mother, Victoria," I whispered, the vow vibrating through the air like a chord struck on a cello. "You will have a fortress. I will build walls so high that his regret won't be able to scale them. I will build a life so brilliant that it will cast a shadow over everything he tries to achieve." He wanted to walk away from us because he thought we were a weakness. I am going to make sure we are the very thing that breaks him. Claire looked at me then, her eyes widening as she sensed the atmospheric shift in the room. The air felt charged, heavy with the scent of an impending storm. "Diana?" she asked softly. "I'm fine, Claire," I said, and for the first time since the contractions started I meant it. "In fact, I've never been better." He gave me the papers, he gave me the check, and he gave me the door. He thinks he's free. I looked back at my daughter, my miracle, my victory. He doesn't realize he just handed me the keys to the kingdom. We aren't just going to survive this, Claire. We are going to become the nightmare he never saw coming. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the hospital blinds, I didn't see the end of a marriage. I saw the beginning of an empire. The stitches in my skin would heal into scars, and those scars would be my armor. I was no longer a woman waiting to be loved. I was a mother preparing for war. And as Victoria's tiny hand curled around my thumb, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would be enough. I would be more than enough. I would be everything. The transition from a life of curated luxury to a sanctuary of necessity was not a descent. It was a purification. Our new world was a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's television, and the radiator hissed like an angry spirit. It was a shoebox of aspirations, cluttered with the chaotic architecture of motherhood and the relentless machinery of a woman reinventing herself from the ashes. In the Davidson mansion, the silence had been heavy and curated. Here it was replaced by the constant rhythmic soundtrack of survival, the hum of the refrigerator, the whir of my laptop fan, and the soft, snuffly breathing of Victoria. The startup years were a masterclass in the alchemy of exhaustion. I existed in a state of perpetual motion, my days measured not in hours, but in ounces of milk and lines of code. I became a creature of the margins, reclaiming the quiet hours between midnight and dawn to build the consulting firm I had once only dreamed of leading. I remember sitting at a second-hand desk, the blue light of the screen illuminating the dark circles under my eyes, with Victoria strapped to my chest in a fabric wrap. I was a two-headed beast of burden, one head focused on the intricacies of market disruption and investor ROI, the other tuned to the subtle shift in my daughter's breathing that signaled a waking hunger. The conflict was visceral. I recall a specific afternoon, the sunlight streaming through our single window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I was on a high-stakes conference call with 3 venture capitalists, my voice steady and professional as I dissected a competitor's fatal flaw, while Victoria was latched to my breast. I was a paradox in a silk blouse and sweatpants, navigating a male-dominated corporate landscape with the sharp, clinical precision of a shark, while my body performed the most ancient and vulnerable act of nurturance. When she would fuss, I would simply mute the line, hum a low, vibrating note into the crown of her head until she settled, and then unmute to deliver a closing argument that left the room silent. They had no idea that the woman advising them on million-dollar pivots was currently covered in the faint scent of spit-up and unyielding resolve. In the top drawer of that scarred wooden desk sat the manila envelope. Inside lay the check Alex had sent, the pity check, the blood money. To most, it would have been a lifeline, a way to move into a better neighborhood or buy a car that didn't rattle at every stoplight. To me, it was a relic of failure, a certificate of abandonment that I refused to dignify with a signature. Cashing it would have been an admission that I needed him, that his rejection had left a hole that only his money could fill. Instead, I left it there untouched, a memento mori of a marriage that had died in a hospital room. On the days when my spirit flagged, when the weight of being everything to someone felt like it might crush my ribs, I would open that drawer and stare at the check. It wasn't greed that kept it there. It was spite refined and distilled into a potent fuel. I wanted to be able to say when the time came that I had built our empire without a single cent of Davidson charity. Then there was James. James Cooper, the man Alex had used as a weapon against me, entered our lives not as a lover or a conspirator, but as a sentinel. He had heard of my resignation and Alex's sudden, public divorce, and he had seen through the Davidson smokescreen immediately. He found us in that cramped apartment, looking entirely too polished for the linoleum floors and the smell of pureed carrots. He didn't offer pity. He offered a challenge. "You're wasting that brain on mid-level contracts, Olivia," he told me, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles as he watched Victoria play with a set of wooden blocks. He had started calling me by my middle name, a quiet way of acknowledging the woman I was becoming, separate from the wife I had been. "Davidson Corp is losing its edge because they lost you. But their loss is the market's opportunity. I have a list of clients who are tired of the old guard's arrogance. They want a strategist who knows how to survive a storm." James became the intellectual whetstone upon which I sharpened my ambition. He pushed me to think bigger, to move from consulting into equity, to leverage my knowledge of the Davidson family's internal rot into a competitive advantage. But more importantly, he became the paternal presence that Victoria's life was missing. He was the one who taught her how to play chess on Sunday afternoons, his weathered hands moving the pieces with the same deliberate care he used to guide my career. He didn't try to replace her father. He simply occupied the space that a father should have filled, providing a stable, wise, and unwavering foundation. Victoria grew up believing that a man's strength was measured by his consistency and his intellect, not by the cars he drove or the lies he told to protect his ego. Those years were a blur of Sisyphusian labor and incremental victories. We lived on coffee, ambition, and the fierce joy of our own company. I watched Victoria transform from a fragile miracle into a sturdy, inquisitive child with a laugh that could brighten even the grayest city afternoon. And I transformed too. The softness that Alex had once found so charming had been replaced by a lean, hungry intelligence. I learned to turn my anger into a cold, calculating discipline. I wasn't just working to survive. I was working to transcend. I remember one night, after a particularly grueling week of negotiations that had finally secured my firm its first major retainer, I stood on the small balcony of our apartment. The city lights twinkled below like earthbound stars, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was looking up from a hole. I felt like I was standing on a precipice, looking down at a world I was beginning to own. I looked back inside at Victoria, asleep in her crib, and James, who was tidying up the chess set. The alchemy of struggle had done its work. It had burned away the dross of my former life, the need for Alex's approval, the fear of the Davidson name, the insecurity of being alone. What remained was something pure, something indestructible. I was building a fortress brick by brick, contract by contract, and every night that the check remained uncashed in the drawer was a victory. I was no longer the woman who had been discarded. I was the architect of a new reality. Alex Davidson had thought he had left me with nothing, but in the crucible of that one-bedroom apartment, I had discovered that nothing was simply the space required to build everything. The glass in my new office was so clear it felt like an invitation to step into the sky. It was a far cry from the streaked, single-pane window of our one-bedroom apartment where I had spent years watching the city through a veil of grime and struggle. This glass was reinforced, soundproofed, and expensive. A transparent barrier between the world I had conquered and the woman I had become. At 32, I stood at the center of a room that smelled of Italian leather, expensive espresso, and the cold, sharp scent of success. Romano Strategic Consulting was no longer a desperate dream scratched into the margins of diaper receipts. It was a predator in the market, and I was its heart. The irony of our location was a secret I kept tucked close to my ribs, a private joke shared only with the ghost of the woman I used to be. My office sat on the 40th floor of the Meridian Tower, and directly across the street, so close I could see the flick of a cigarette on the executive terrace, loomed the monolithic gray slab of Davidson Corporation. For 5 years, that building had been the sun around which my trauma orbited. Now it was simply a landmark. I didn't look at it out of obsession or a lingering need for Alex's gaze. I looked at it because it was a benchmark. Every time I secured a client they had lost, every time our stock analytics outperformed their quarterly projections, I would stand at that window and drink my coffee. I wasn't staring at an enemy. I was staring at a relic. Victoria was 5 now, a vibrant, ethereal blend of my determination and a grace that was entirely her own. She didn't go to a standard daycare. On the days she wasn't at her preparatory academy, she was here, in the Romano fortress. She had her own corner of my office, a small table crafted from the same dark walnut as my desk, where she didn't play with dolls or mindless trinkets. She played chess. "Mom, the knight is a sneaky piece, isn't it?" she asked one afternoon, her brow furrowed in a concentration that looked far too heavy for a child her age. "It jumps over the walls everyone else has to walk around." I watched her from my desk, my heart doing that strange, painful somersault it always did when I saw my own resilience reflected in her. She didn't play like a child. She didn't make impulsive moves or cry when she lost a pawn. She played like a grandmaster, her small fingers hovering over the board, calculating 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. She had inherited my strategic mind, a trait I had developed out of a desperate need to survive, but one she was honing into a weapon of choice. While other children were learning to share, Victoria was learning to anticipate. She understood that life was a series of positions, and that the most dangerous person at the table was the one who was willing to sacrifice the most for the endgame. James Cooper often sat across from her, his laughter echoing through the glass-walled suite. He had officially retired from active consulting, but he remained my chairman emeritus and Victoria's Uncle James. He was the one who had given her that chess set, a hand-carved marble masterpiece. "She's got your eyes, Diana," James said, leaning back after Victoria had trapped his queen in a classic Sicilian defense. "But she's got a coldness in her play that you didn't develop until the hospital. She was born into the battle. She doesn't know what it's like to play for fun. She plays to win." That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had built this life to protect her, to ensure she never felt the sting of lack or the cold shadow of abandonment. But in doing so, I had raised a child who saw the world as a board to be mastered. I had traded her innocence for her invulnerability. Was it a fair trade? I looked at her, secure, brilliant, and fiercely loved, and compared her to the terrified infant I had carried out of that hospital. The answer was always yes. Business was booming. The corporate world was beginning to whisper about the Romano method. We were the firm you called when the old dynasties like the Davidsons failed to adapt to the digital shift. We were lean, we were fast, and we were ruthless. I had spent the last 5 years studying the Davidson family's vulnerabilities like a surgeon studying a tumor. I knew their supply chain weaknesses, their bloated middle management, and the way Margaret's ego often clouded her fiscal judgment. I wasn't actively sabotaging them yet. I was simply outpositioning them. I was the knight Victoria had described, jumping over the walls they didn't even know they'd built. One rainy Tuesday I saw him. Through the high-powered telescope I kept in my office, a gift from a client that I used to check the weather, I saw Alex. He was standing on the Davidson terrace, a glass of something amber in his hand. Even from this distance, his silhouette looked diminished. The arrogance that had once defined his gait seemed weighed down by something I couldn't quite name. He looked toward my building, toward the Romano logo glowing in blue neon against the gray sky. He didn't know I was there. He didn't know that the woman he had discarded was currently holding the contracts of 3 of his top 5 investors. I turned away from the window and walked over to Victoria's table. She had just finished her game with James and was meticulously resetting the pieces. "Ready to go, Victoria?" I asked, smoothing her dark curls. "One more game, Mom?" She looked up, her eyes wide and intelligent. "I want to try the Queen's Gambit. James says it's a high-risk opening, but if you do it right, the opponent never recovers." I sat down across from her, the heavy scent of my own success surrounding us. I looked at the board, then at my daughter, and finally at the manila envelope that still sat, uncashed and yellowed with age, in the bottom drawer of my desk. It was no longer a symbol of my pain. It was a receipt for a debt that was nearly paid. The Queen's Gambit, I murmured, moving my pawn forward. A very appropriate choice, Victoria. Let's see if you can pull it off. As we played, the lights of the city began to flicker on, mirroring the stars. I realized then that I was no longer looking up at the summit. I was standing on it. And the most beautiful part of the view wasn't the skyline or the success. It was the fact that I had reached it with my daughter's hand in mine, while the man who had tried to bury us was still standing in the rain, wondering why his world was getting so cold. The meeting was a clandestine affair, arranged through a series of cryptic messages that felt more like espionage than a family reunion. The venue was the Gentry, a private club so entrenched in old money tradition that the very air seemed to be composed of cigar smoke, aged scotch, and the hushed whispers of men who moved the world from leather armchairs. It was the kind of place where the Davidsons felt at home, and the kind of place I had spent the last 5 years making sure I could buy and sell twice over. As I walked through the mahogany-paneled foyer, my heels clicking a sharp, defiant rhythm against the Persian rugs, I realized I was no longer intimidated by this world. I was its predator. Thomas Davidson was sitting in a secluded corner booth, the shadows cast by the flickering fireplace carving deep, weary grooves into his face. He looked older than his years. The one straight spine of the Davidson patriarch now bowed under the weight of a secret that clearly tasted like poison. When he saw me, he didn't offer a smile. He offered a look of such profound, sepulchral regret that I felt a momentary flicker of the pity I had spent years trying to kill. "Diana," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask for a moment of your time." "You're right, Thomas. You don't," I replied, sitting across from him without waiting for an invitation. I didn't order a drink. I didn't take off my coat. I wanted him to know I was merely a visitor in his dying world. "So let's skip the pleasantries. Why am I here?" He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached down and lifted a heavy, weathered leather portfolio from the floor, placing it on the table between us with a thud that sounded like a lid closing on a coffin. He pushed it toward me, his hand trembling slightly. "I've spent 15 years watching my wife tear the world down to fit her specifications," he began, his eyes fixed on his glass of neat bourbon. "Margaret doesn't see people, Diana. She sees assets and liabilities. And from the moment Alex brought you home, she saw you as a liability that threatened the purity of the Davidson legacy. She called it her grand design, a way to ensure that Alex remained under her thumb, forever grateful for her protection." I opened the portfolio. The first thing I saw was a medical report. The paper yellowed at the edges, but the ink as sharp as a blade. It was a fertility workup for Alex, dated 2 years before Victoria was born. I scanned the lines of clinical data, the percentages, the final diagnosis. My breath hitched in my throat. Alex was effectively sterile. The chances of him fathering a child naturally were less than 1%. He knew. I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. "No," Thomas said, looking up at me with eyes full of shame. "Margaret intercepted the results. She told him he was fine, but she kept the truth in her safe. Then when you got pregnant, she saw her opening. She didn't just want you gone. She wanted you destroyed. She needed Alex to believe that Victoria was a product of betrayal, because if he knew she was his miracle, he would never have let you go. And if he never let you go, Margaret would lose her control over him." I turned the page. What followed was a sickening gallery of my own life, seen through the distorted lens of a private investigator. There were photos of me and James Cooper, innocent coffee meetings, professional handshakes, a moment where James had placed a paternal hand on my shoulder after a particularly grueling board meeting. But these weren't just photos. They had been surgically altered. Timestamps had been changed to midnight hours. Shadows had been deepened to suggest intimacy. In one photo, a blurred figure that looked vaguely like me was seen entering a hotel with a man whose silhouette had been cropped to match James's. It was a masterpiece of maleficence. "She showed him these while you were in labor," Thomas continued, his voice shaking. "She planted the seeds of doubt months before, whispering about James's influence and your ambition. Then while you were screaming in that delivery room, she handed him this portfolio. She told him she had saved him from a lifetime of raising another man's bastard. She gave him a way to be a victim instead of a failure." The room began to spin. A cold, crystalline fury began to rise from the pit of my stomach, A heat so intense it felt like it would melt the very floor beneath me. This wasn't just a divorce. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a marriage that had simply failed under pressure. It was a targeted assassination of my character. Margaret Davidson had sat at my dinner table, held my hand during my pregnancy, and smiled at me across holiday turkeys, all while she was meticulously weaving a noose to hang me with. I looked at the photos of Victoria, tiny, grainy images taken through a telephoto lens during our first year in that one-bedroom apartment. Margaret had been watching us. She had watched us struggle, watched us go hungry, watched me balance a laptop and a crying infant, and she had felt nothing but the satisfaction of a job well done. "Why are you telling me this now, Thomas?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating hum. "Why not 5 years ago? Why not when I was being wheeled out of that hospital with nothing but a check and a broken heart?" "Because the company is dying, Diana," he admitted, his face crumbling. "Margaret's grand design has rotted the foundation. She's alienated the board, sabotaged Alex's confidence until he's a ghost of himself, and now she's trying to sell the company out from under us to cover her own tracks. I'm a coward, Diana. I stayed silent to keep the peace, but I can't watch her destroy Victoria's birthright too." I stood up, clutching the portfolio to my chest. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. Every struggle, every sleepless night, every ounce of spite I had used as fuel. It all had a name now. It was Margaret. "This isn't about the company, Thomas," I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from his face. "This is about the fact that you let a monster rewrite my life. You let her steal my daughter's father and my husband's sanity because you were too afraid to break a sweat." I didn't wait for his apology. I walked out of the gentry, the cold night air hitting my face like a benediction. I looked across the street at the Davidson building, its lights twinkling like cold, indifferent stars. For years I had thought I was fighting Alex. I had thought he was the one who had decided I wasn't enough. But as I stepped into my car and looked at the leather portfolio in the passenger seat, I realized the truth. Alex wasn't my enemy. He was just the weapon Margaret had used to cut me. My real enemy was still sitting in her ivory tower, convinced she had won. I pulled out my phone and dialed James. "James," I said, my voice as hard as a diamond, "remember that Queen's Gambit Victoria was talking about? It's time to move the pieces. I don't just want the market share anymore. I want the throne. And I want to watch Margaret Davidson burn while I sit on it." As I drove away, I didn't feel the weight of the betrayal anymore. I felt light. I felt dangerous. The messenger of regret had delivered more than just the truth. He had delivered the final coordinates for my revenge. The assassination was over. Now the counterinsurgency began. The floor of my office was no longer a surface of polished oak. It was a map of a decade-old homicide, the cold-blooded murder of my reputation. We sat in the center of the wreckage, Claire and I, surrounded by the paper trail of Margaret Davidson's meticulous malice. The ambient hum of the city far below was the only sound in the room, save for the dry, rhythmic rustle of bank statements and the crinkle of vellum pages. It was 2 a.m., and the blue moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long skeletal shadows across the evidence of my own undoing. Claire was hunched over a stack of wire transfer records, her eyes red-rimmed and fierce. I was holding the heart of the darkness, Margaret's private diaries. They were bound in exquisite calfskin, the kind of journals people used to record poetry or travel memoirs. But Margaret had used them to catalog a crusade. As I turned the pages, her handwriting, elegant, looping, and terrifyingly precise, felt like a razor wire being pulled across my skin. She hadn't just hated me. She had studied me like a specimen in a jar. "She paid them," Claire whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated rage. "Diana, look at this. A series of payments to Lighthouse Investigations starting 6 months before you even went into labor. And here, the creative services fee to a digital imaging firm in Switzerland. She didn't just find evidence, she commissioned it. She bought a version of reality that suited her, and she paid for it with the company's petty cash." I didn't look up. I was staring at an entry dated July 14th, the peak of my final trimester. "The infestation grows," Margaret had written. "I watched her today at lunch. She thinks she belongs at this table. She thinks a child with her common blood can carry the Davidson weight." I will not allow the dilution of a century's worth of excellence. If Alex is too weak to excise the rot, I will be the surgeon. The Cooper angle is developing nicely. A few more grains of salt in the wound of his ego, and Alex will be ready to cut her out himself. The phrase common blood hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so archaic, so profoundly arrogant, that it made my stomach turn. To Margaret, I wasn't a person, a wife, or even a mother. I was a biological contaminant. My daughter, the miracle she knew was Alex's only chance at a legacy, was nothing more to her than a mistake of diluted genetics. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was eugenic. It was a visceral, soul-deep rejection of my very existence. She knew Victoria was his, I said, my voice barely a tremor in the quiet room. She knew about his fertility issues, she knew about the miracle, and she decided that his only child was a liability, because she didn't come from a pedigree Margaret approved of. She didn't just steal my husband, Claire. She tried to steal Victoria's right to exist. I felt a cold, obsidian-hard clarity settle over me. The grief was gone, burned away by the sheer intensity of the evidence. I stood up, my joints popping in the silence, and walked over to the whiteboard. I began to pin the documents up one by one. Here was the payment to the private investigator. There was the doctored photo. Beside it, the real photo I had found in Thomas's portfolio. I added Dr. Rebecca Chin's original medical records from the night of the birth. The documents that proved Victoria's blood type and DNA markers were an undeniable match for the Davidson line. Records Margaret had successfully suppressed by threatening the hospital's board of directors. This was the architecture of my fortress. This was the paper trail of malice that would become Margaret's cage. Every trophy she had kept, the copies of the fake messages, the receipts for the lies, was now a brick in the wall I was building around her. I realized then that Margaret's greatest weakness was her own vanity. She was so convinced of her intellectual superiority that she had kept these records like medals of honor, never imagining that the common blood she despised would ever rise high enough to see over her walls. We aren't just filing a lawsuit, Claire, I said, looking at the map of corruption I had created. We are building a cage. I want every board member to see these diaries. I want the shareholders to see how their money was used to fabrication scandals. I want the world to see the grand design for what it really is. The delusions of a dying aristocrat who would rather destroy her family than lose her grip on the steering wheel. Claire stood up, coming to stand beside me. She looked at the wall of evidence, then at me. She has no idea who she's dealing with, Diana. She remembers the girl in the hospital bed. She has no idea that girl died and a warrior took her place. Let her keep her illusions, I replied. It will make the fall that much longer. I picked up Dr. Chin's folder, the final nail in the coffin. It contained a letter Rebecca had written to me, kept in a sealed envelope for 15 years, to be opened only if I ever found the strength to look back. In it, she detailed the exact moment Alex had walked out and the way Margaret had entered the room minutes later, not to comfort me, but to tell the doctor that Mrs. Davidson's services are no longer required here. The legal arsenal was complete. I had the motive, the means, and the paper trail. I had the medical proof of Victoria's paternity, and the financial proof of Margaret's fraud. But more than that, I had the visceral driving hunger of a mother whose child had been called common. I looked back at the Davidson Court building through the window. It looked smaller now. The lights were still on in the executive suite, and I imagined Margaret sitting there, drinking her tea, convinced she was the architect of the future. I touched the glass, my fingertips cold. The common blood is coming for you, Margaret, I whispered. And I'm bringing the storm with me. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the office in shades of bruised purple and gold, I didn't feel tired. I felt electrified. The fortress was built. The evidence was catalogued. The Romano dossier was ready. Tomorrow the first moves of the endgame would begin. Margaret Davidson had spent 15 years writing my story as a tragedy. I was about to spend the next few months rewriting it as a revolution. I turned to Claire, a grim, triumphant smile touching my lips. Call the legal team. Tell them we don't just want a settlement. We want a total takeover. It's time to show the Davidsons what happens when you try to bury a miracle in the dirt. The evening had begun with the quiet, rhythmic luxury of a life reclaimed. Rain was slicking the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, blurring the city lights into a fractured kaleidoscope of amber and violet. Inside, the air was scented with expensive sandalwood and the faint, earthy aroma of the tea Victoria had brewed. We were sitting in the living room, a space of minimalist elegance that felt more like a sanctuary than a home, discussing the nuances of a hostile takeover bid I was preparing. It was a Tuesday like any other, until the doorbell rang. It wasn't the frantic buzz of a courier or the polite chime of a neighbor. It was a slow, heavy thud of sound that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of my feet. When I opened the door, the air in the hallway felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the building. I didn't see the man who had haunted my nightmares for a decade and a half. I didn't see the arrogant executive with the razor-sharp jawline and the expensive leather shoes that squeaked with the sound of betrayal. Instead, I was looking at a specter. Alex Davidson stood in the threshold, but he was a shell, a hollowed-out monument to a life built on sand. His designer suit, still impeccably tailored, hung loosely on a frame that had become skeletal. His skin had the translucent, sallow quality of old parchment, and his eyes, once burning with a cold brown fire, were now recessed into deep, bruised hollows. "Olivia," he whispered. The name felt like a violation. He used the name James had given me, the name of the woman he didn't know. His voice was a dry, papery rasp, devoid of the booming authority that had once commanded boardrooms. I didn't move. I didn't let him in. I stood there, a statue of obsidian and silk, watching him sway slightly as if the mere act of standing was a labor he could no longer afford. "Alex," I said, my voice as flat and clinical as a surgeon's report. "You look like you're waiting for a funeral." "I suppose I am," he replied, a ghost of a bitter smile twitching at the corners of his mouth. He didn't ask to enter. He simply waited, a beggar at the gates of the fortress he had forced me to build. "I didn't come for forgiveness, Diana. I know that well is dry. I came because I ran out of time and the Empire is burning." The shock didn't come from his presence. It came from the realization that the man who had tried to destroy me was already being destroyed by his own biology. He told me then, right there in the hallway, his words punctuated by a wet, rattling cough. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors had stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort. He wasn't there for a happy ending or a cinematic reconciliation. He was there because Margaret's grand design had finally reached its logical, catastrophic conclusion. With Alex dying and Thomas broken, the Davidson legacy was a rudderless ship, and the board of directors were circling like sharks, ready to tear the carcass apart. "I lost everything trying to keep what Mother told me was mine," he said, his hand trembling as he reached out to steady himself against the doorframe. "And now, as I'm fading, I realize the only thing that was ever actually mine is the one thing I threw away in that hospital." Before I could respond, I heard the soft, deliberate click of heels on the hardwood behind me. Victoria stepped into the foyer. At 15, she was a masterpiece of my own making, tall, poised, and radiating a quiet, terrifying intelligence. She didn't look like a child meeting her father for the first time. She looked like a judge approaching a defendant. She stopped beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, a silent declaration of where her loyalty lived. The silence that followed was visceral. Alex's breath hitched in his throat, a jagged sobbing sound that he quickly suppressed. He looked at her, and for a moment, the years of lies and Margaret's poisonous whispers seemed to vanish. He saw the dark curls, the sharp brow, and the unmistakable strategic depth in her eyes. He saw the daughter he had denounced as a bastard and a liability, and the sheer weight of the truth seemed to buckle his knees. "Victoria," he breathed, his eyes filling with a desperate, unearned longing. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't run to him with the questions of an abandoned child. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze raking over him with a cool, clinical detachment that made my heart swell with a dark, protective pride. It was the exact look he had given her in the hospital bassinet, the look of a man observing a stranger, a biological error and inconvenience. She was mirroring his own cruelty back at him, polished by 15 years of my tutelage. "You're late," Victoria said. Her voice was a perfect replica of mine, low, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. 15 years, 7 months, and 12 days late. "I finished the environmental audit of your company, by the way." Your middle management is bloated, your R&D is stagnant, and your mother has been embezzling from the pension fund for years. I imagine that's why you're really here." The irony was a physical presence in the room. Alex had come to find a daughter, and instead, he had found a grandmaster who had already analyzed his defeat. He looked at her, then at me, and I saw the moment he realized that his penance wouldn't be found in a hug or a tearful apology. His penance was seeing exactly what he had lost. A daughter who didn't need him, a wife who had outgrown him, and a legacy that was being dismantled by the very common blood he had tried to excise. "She is brilliant," Alex whispered, a single tear tracking through the deep lines of his face. "She is a Romano," I corrected, my voice hard as a diamond, "and she is the only reason I'm not closing this door in your face. If you want to talk about the company, if you want to talk about the legacy you've managed to ruin, you can sit in the kitchen. But don't look for a father-daughter moment, Alex. You traded that for a leather portfolio and a pity check 15 years ago. The miracle you rejected is now the only person who can save what's left of your world." I stepped back, allowing the ghost at the door to enter my sanctuary. He shuffled past us, the scent of antiseptic and decay trailing in his wake, a stark contrast to the vibrant, successful life we had built without him. As I watched him walk toward the kitchen, his shoulders hunched in defeat, I realized that the rhythmic execution of his shoes on the hospital floor had finally come full circle. The sound was gone now, replaced by the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man who knew he was already dead. I looked at Victoria, who was still standing in the foyer, her expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She turned to me, and for a fleeting second, the clinical mask slipped, revealing the fierce, unyielding girl beneath. "I'm fine, Mom. I just wanted to see if he was as small as I imagined." She looked toward the kitchen, then back at me. "He's smaller. Let's go finish him off. We have a company to take." I held a miracle in my arms once, and I had looked at a monster. Now I looked at my daughter, and I saw the fortress I had promised she would become. The war was no longer in the shadows, the enemy was in the kitchen, and the reckoning had finally arrived. The kitchen table, a slab of Carrara marble that usually hosted laughter and strategic planning, now felt like an altar for a sacrificial confession. Alex sat there, the harsh overhead lights catching the tremor in his hands as he clutched a glass of water like a life preserver. I stood by the counter, my arms crossed, a sentinel in my own home. Victoria sat opposite him, her posture perfect, her notebook open. She wasn't there as a daughter, she was there as a court reporter documenting the dissolution of a man. "I wasn't a monster, Diana," Alex began, his voice cracking, a dry sound like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "At least I didn't set out to be. But I was small. I was so incredibly small." He looked at the medical file Victoria had placed between them, the proof of his own infertility that Margaret had hidden. "When Mother showed me those doctored photos of you and James, it wasn't the betrayal that broke me. It was the relief." He let out a jagged, self-loathing laugh. "If you had cheated, then the miracle was a lie. And if the miracle was a lie, then I didn't have to face the fact that I was broken. I was terrified of being a man who couldn't carry on the Davidson line. I chose to believe you were a harlot rather than accept that I was biologically weak. I sacrificed my family to protect my ego." I felt a cold wave of nausea roll over me. For 15 years I had built a vision of Alex as a calculating villain, a man who had intentionally crushed my heart. But looking at him now, I realized the truth was far more pathetic. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a puppet whose strings had been pulled by a mother who knew exactly which insecurities to twist. He hadn't left me because he hated me. He left because he was a coward who couldn't bear the weight of his own truth. "A puppet," I murmured, the word tasting like bile. "All this time I thought I was at war with a man. But you were just a shadow Margaret cast on the wall. That's the real betrayal, Alex. You let her rewrite our lives because you were too fragile to stand up to a lab report." In many ways, this realization was worse than the hatred I had nurtured. Hatred had a dignity to it. It implied a strength of conviction. But this was just a tragedy of character. I had been discarded not for a grand cause, but for the comfort of a lie. Alex didn't look up. He couldn't. "She's liquidating everything, Victoria," he said, turning his hollow gaze to our daughter. Mother has signed a preliminary agreement to merge with a private equity firm that specializes in asset stripping. They'll fire 80% of the staff. They'll sell the patents. They'll erase everything my father and grandfather built, just so she can walk away with $1 billion exit, while the company's reputation is still intact. She'd rather burn the kingdom to the ground than let common blood inherit it. He leaned forward, a desperate, rattling energy seizing him. I am dying. Thomas is too weak to fight her. But Victoria, you have the Romano fire and the Davidson claim. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm not even asking you to save my name. I'm begging you to save the 30,000 families whose lives depend on that company. Don't let her win. Take the chair. Use the evidence Diana has built and stop the merger. Victoria looked at him, her eyes tracking the sweat on his brow with a detached curiosity. She tapped her pen against the marble. You want me to be the hero of a story you started with a pity check? I want you to be the justice I was too afraid to provide, Alex whispered. I watched them, the dying man begging for a legacy and the young woman who had already outgrown him. The Romano women didn't need his company to be successful. We were already wealthy and powerful. But the thought of Margaret Davidson, the woman who had called my daughter an infestation, winning the final move was unacceptable. We have the paper trail of malice, Alex, I said, stepping forward. We have the Swiss bank records of the imaging firm. We have the hospital documents Margaret suppressed. We have enough to bury her in a courtroom for 100 years. Then use it, Alex gasped, his eyes bright with a feverish intensity. The board meets in 48 hours to vote on the merger. I still have the right to introduce an heir to the seat. If you show up, if you show them the truth, they'll have no choice but to oust her. Victoria stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a call to arms. She looked at me, an unspoken question passing between us. We didn't need to say it. The Queen's Gambit wasn't just a game anymore. It was time to take the board. Go home, Alex, Victoria said, her voice final. Get whatever rest your doctors can buy you. We'll be at the meeting. But make no mistake, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I want to see grandmother's face when the infestation takes her chair. As Alex stood to leave, his movements slow and agonizing, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I felt a grim, steady resolve. The coward's confession had stripped away the last of my illusions. The man who had walked out of the hospital was gone, and the man who remained was a ghost. But the monster who had sent him was still alive, and she was about to find out that the common blood she despised had a very long memory. The penthouse was silent after Alex's departure, the air still vibrating with the phantom scent of hospital corridors and dying hopes. Victoria didn't sit down. She paced the length of the living room, her movements fluid and predatory, a stark contrast to the shuffling ghost who had just left. For 15 minutes she said nothing. She was a biological supercomputer, processing 15 years of abandonment, 15 minutes of a coward's confession, and a lifetime of common blood rhetoric into a singular cohesive strategy. I watched her from the shadows of the kitchen, my heart aching with a mixture of pride and a strange cold sorrow. I had raised her to be this way, to be the sword that wouldn't break, but seeing the light of childhood finally vanish from her eyes was a heavy price to pay for her invulnerability. He wants a savior, Victoria said suddenly, stopping in front of the window that looked out over the Davidson building. He wants me to be the dutiful daughter who steps in to fix the mess he was too weak to prevent. He wants a graceful transition. She turned to face me, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the city. But grace is for people who didn't walk out of hospital rooms. I'm not saving his legacy, Mom. I'm taking it. I'm going to strip that company down to its atoms, scrub out Margaret's rot, and rebuild it in our image. Davidson Corp is dead. Long live Romano Davidson. Those are the terms? I asked, stepping into the light. Those are the only terms, she replied. He signs over his controlling interest tonight. Not as a trust, not as a someday inheritance. I want full voting rights before I step foot in that boardroom. If he wants to save those 30,000 families, he has to hand me the keys to the kingdom and then get out of the way. The alliance was forged in the hours that followed. James arrived shortly after midnight, his face grim as he reviewed the legal documents we had prepared. He brought with him a team of forensic accountants and 3 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state. Men who didn't argue, they dismantled. We gathered around the marble table. The paper trail of malice spread out like a battle map. Shutterstock Jelajahi. Margaret thinks she has the board in her pocket because she's promising them a golden parachute through this merger, James explained, his pen circling the names of the key swing voters. But these men aren't loyal to Margaret. They're loyal to their own survival. When Victoria walks in with proof of Margaret's embezzlement and the doctored evidence she used to manipulate the CO, that golden parachute is going to look a lot like a noose. We lead with the science, Victoria interjected, her voice sharp and authoritative. We show them the fertility reports. We show them that my paternity was never in doubt, which makes every move Margaret made to exclude me a breach of fiduciary duty. Then we hit them with the environmental audit. I have evidence that they've been dumping chemical runoff in the northern basin to save 6% on disposal costs. It's not just a scandal. It's a federal crime. I looked at the 2 of them, James, the wise architect of my career, and Victoria, the brilliant executioner of my revenge. We were no longer the discarded ones. We were no longer the victims of a grand design. We were the architects of a new era. The Romano women had spent 15 years in the wilderness, and we hadn't just survived. We had conquered the terrain. Diana, James said, looking at me with a profound, quiet respect. You realize that once we walk through those doors, there's no going back. Margaret will fight like a cornered animal. I hope she does, I replied, feeling a cold, crystalline calm settle over me. I want her to fight. I want her to use every ounce of her aristocratic strength, so she can feel exactly how much it hurts when the common blood breaks her grip. We worked through the night, fueled by espresso and a decade and a half of stored-up justice. We rehearsed the opening statements, the presentation of the medical fraud, and the final crushing delivery of the heir's terms. Victoria was flawless, her mind a steel trap, her delivery a razor. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was the physical manifestation of my resilience. As the sun began to rise, painting the city in the blood-orange hues of a new day, we stood together at the window. Across the street, the Davidson building caught the first light, its glass reflecting the dawn. It looked fragile now, a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Are you ready, Victoria? I asked. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the building she was about to own. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer, a charcoal gray suit that mimicked the one I had worn the day I opened my own firm. I've been ready since the day he left, Mom. He just didn't know it yet. The alliance was set. The executioners were ready. We weren't going to the boardroom for a discussion. We were going for a coronation. And as we walked toward the elevator, the rhythmic click of our heels on the floor didn't sound like a rhythmic execution. It sounded like a heartbeat, the steady, unstoppable pulse of a legacy that was finally truly ours. The mahogany double doors of the Davidson Court boardroom didn't just open. They surrendered. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of old wood, expensive tobacco, and the desperate, cloying perfume of a dying era. At the head of the table sat Margaret Davidson, a queen in a collapsing castle. Her silver hair was coiffed into a rigid helmet, her spine as unyielding as the granite she had tried to bury us under. Surrounding her were the 12 members of the board, men who had spent 15 years looking the other way while a family was dismantled for the sake of a grand design. This meeting is for voting members only, Margaret announced, her voice a sharp, brittle porcelain. She didn't look at us. She looked at the agenda in front of her, as if we were merely dust motes dancing in the light. Security will escort you out if you don't leave voluntarily. Then you'd better call them, Margaret, I said, stepping into the room. My voice was a calm, resonant low that seemed to vibrate the water in the crystal carafes on the table. Because we aren't leaving until the board sees the truth about the woman leading them into a federal indictment. The room shifted. Necks craned. Whispers died in throats. Victoria stepped forward, her presence a silent, terrifying thunderclap. She placed a heavy leather folder, the paper trail of malice, directly in front of Thomas, who sat at the opposite end of the table, his eyes wet with a mixture of terror and relief. I am Victoria Romano Davidson, she began, her voice cutting through the room like a cold front. And as of 6 a.m. this morning, I hold the proxy for the controlling interest of this corporation. This meeting is no longer about a merger. It is about an autopsy. Shutterstock Jelajahi. The blood drained from Margaret's face, leaving her looking like a waxwork figure left too close to a fire. You have no standing here. Alex would never. Alex is dying, grandmother, Victoria interrupted, the word grandmother sounding like a curse. And in his final moments of clarity, he realized that the only thing more dangerous to his legacy than his own cowardice was your sociopathy. Chapter by chapter, Victoria began the dismantling. She didn't lead with emotion. She led with the cold, undeniable geometry of fact. She projected the Swiss bank records onto the wall, the paper trail of the creative services Margaret had paid for to doctor the photos of me and James. She read aloud from Margaret's own diaries, the words common blood and infestation, echoing through the sterile room like a death knell. The board members, men who prided themselves on their traditional values, looked away in shame as the depth of the depravity was laid bare. She didn't just lie to her son, Victoria said, her gaze raking over the men at the table. She used shareholder funds to facilitate a character assassination. She suppressed medical records. Here is Dr. Chin's original report, that proved my paternity 15 years ago. She withheld the truth about her son's health to keep him compliant. And while she was playing God with our lives, she was embezzling from the Environmental Compliance Fund to pay for the cover-up. The climax was a symphony of destruction. Victoria pulled out the final document, the federal audit of the Northern Basin. The merger you are all about to vote on is a fraud. Margaret isn't saving the company. She's selling you into a RICO investigation. She has been dumping toxic runoff for a decade, and she's trying to exit before the EPA issues the warrants. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an empire's heart stopping. Margaret stood up, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the table to keep from falling. Her mask finally shattered, revealing the jagged, ugly soul beneath. You little gutter rat, she hissed, her voice a serpent's whisper. You think you can walk in here with your mother's common, grasping hands and take what I built? I am this company. I am the Davidson name. No, Margaret, I said, stepping closer until I could see the panic in her pale eyes. You are just the woman who tried to bury a miracle. But you forgot one thing about miracles. They grow best in the dark. Thomas stood up then, his voice finally finding the strength it had lacked for 15 years. The board moves for the immediate removal of Margaret Davidson from all chair and executive positions. Effective immediately. All those in favor. 12 hands rose. It wasn't a vote, it was an exorcism. Margaret looked around the room, seeing only the backs of the men she had once commanded. She turned to me, her face a contorted map of rage and disbelief. You planned this. From that bed. You planned this. I didn't plan it, Margaret, I replied, a grim, satisfied smile touching my lips. I just survived it. You're the one who wrote the script. I'm just the one who provided the ending. 2 security guards, men who had once tipped their hats to her, stepped into the room. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a final, humiliating punctuation mark. As she was led out, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the floor, she looked smaller than the desk she had ruled from. The common blood she feared had become the very current that swept her away. Victoria sat down in the headchair. The seat was still warm from Margaret's departure, but when my daughter occupied it, the energy of the room changed. It wasn't a place of secrets anymore. It was a place of work. She looked at the board members, her expression unreadable. Now, Victoria said, opening a new file. Let's talk about the cleanup. We have 30,000 families to protect, and we're starting with a full disclosure of the environmental violations. This company is going to learn what it means to be a Romano. I stood by the window watching the city below. The sun was high now, the shadows of the Davidson building shortening as the day reached its peak. For 15 years, I had carried the weight of a betrayal that felt like a mountain. But as I watched my daughter lead the room, I realized the mountain was gone. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been built brick by brick, into a fortress that would outlast us all. The boardroom bloodbath was over, and the reign of the survivors had begun. The following months were a study in the agonizingly slow compression of time. While Victoria spent her days in the boardroom dismantling Margaret's corruption, her evenings were spent in a much quieter, more suffocating theater. The penthouse suite where Alex Davidson was fading into a ghost. The air there always felt heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and the sterile, sharp sting of morphine. It was here, in the gilded cage of his final days, that the transitional grace took place. A strange, liminal season where the past and future met in a room that smelled of endings. I found myself an accidental witness to the most complex performance of Alex's life. He was a man trying to cram 15 years of fatherhood into 6 months of biological decay. It was a frantic, desperate effort. He wanted to tell Victoria about the Davidson family history, about the summer he learned to sail, about the way his own father had looked at him before the business swallowed them both. He wanted to be the hero he had failed to be in that hospital room, but he was doing it with a body that was betraying him faster than Margaret ever had. I watched him from the doorway, a silent sentinel in a war that had technically ended. I didn't enter the room often. I didn't want to offer him the comfort of my presence, yet I found a strange, crystalline peace in the observation. The obsidian-hard hatred I had carried for 15 years hadn't evaporated. It had simply settled like silt at the bottom of a calm lake. I realized, watching him struggle to breathe while explaining the intricacies of the company's offshore holdings to Victoria, that I didn't need to forgive him to be free of him. Forgiveness was a gift for the repentant. Peace was a gift I gave myself. I no longer carried the weight of hating him because he was no longer significant enough to warrant the energy. He was just a man, fragile and failing, being outshone by the daughter he had once called a liability. Victoria was a marvel of emotional architecture. She sat by his bedside not with the warmth of a daughter, but with the focused, empathetic precision of a biographer. She listened to his stories, she took notes on the company's black box projects, and she allowed him to hold her hand when the pain became too sharp. She didn't call him Dad. The word remained a bridge too far, but she gave him the dignity of her attention. She was allowing him to believe he was passing something on, even as she was methodically preparing to bury the parts of his legacy that didn't serve the future. "I used to wonder what you sounded like," Victoria said one evening, her voice soft against the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen concentrator. "I used to imagine you had a voice like thunder. But you're actually quite quiet, aren't you, Alex?" Alex let out a wet, rattling laugh that turned into a cough. "I was only loud when I was hiding, Victoria. Truly powerful people, like your mother, they don't need to shout. I spent my life trying to sound like a Davidson. I should have spent it trying to be a Romano." He looked toward the doorway then, catching my eye. There was no plea for mercy in his gaze, only a profound, hollowed-out recognition. He knew that I was the architect of his current situation. He knew that the only reason he was dying in a room with his daughter instead of in a cold, lonely wing of a hospice was because I had allowed it. In that moment, the power dynamic was absolute. I was the one with the life, the health, and the future. He was the one with the regrets. The father's final act came on a Tuesday, a day of gray skies and persistent weeping rain. The legal team was present, standing like vultures in the corners of the room. Alex was propped up against a mountain of pillows, his skin almost the same color as the white linen. He looked at the document spread out on his lap, the final transfer of all controlling interests, the dissolution of the Margaret Davidson Trust, and the official renaming of the primary holdings. His hand shook as he took the pen. He looked at Victoria, who was standing at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of professional composure. "This is the only thing I have left that is worth anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. "It's not a gift, Victoria. It's a restitution. I'm not giving you a company. I'm giving you back the life I tried to steal from you." He signed. The ink was dark and defiant on the page. Alex Davidson, the final stroke of a man who was finally, in the 11th hour, doing one right thing. He dropped the pen, his eyes closing as if the mere weight of the signature had exhausted his last reserves of spirit. The common blood now owned every brick, every patent, and every soul within the Davidson empire. The circle hadn't just closed. It had been redrawn with Victoria at the center. In the weeks that followed, the transition became a quiet, professional drift toward the inevitable. Alex spoke less and slept more. Victoria and I began moving our things into the executive suite at the headquarters, the Romano logo now standing side by side with the Davidson name on the directory. We were no longer fighting for a seat at the table. We had built a new table entirely. On the final night, I sat in the living room of the penthouse while Victoria sat with him. The silence of the apartment was profound, a vacuum created by the end of a 15-year storm. I looked at the manila envelope I had finally brought with me, the uncashed check from the hospital. I walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the small decorative flame. I watched the paper curl, the pity money turning into ash and smoke, vanishing into the night air. It was the final tether, the last piece of evidence that I had ever belonged to him. Victoria came out of the room an hour later. Her eyes were dry, but her face held the weight of a woman who had just seen the end of an era. She didn't say anything. She just walked over and leaned her head on my shoulder. "He's gone," she whispered. "I know," I replied, smoothing her hair. We stood there for a long time looking out at the city lights. The transitional grace was over. The man who had denied her existence was gone, and the woman who had fought for it was standing at the summit. Alex had spent his final months trying to give us a legacy, but as I looked at my daughter, strong, brilliant, and entirely her own person, I realized that the only legacy that mattered was the one we had built in the dark, in that one-bedroom apartment, with nothing but a check we refused to cash and a vow we refused to break. The circle was closed. The debt was paid. And for the first time in 15 years, the morning didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a beginning. The architecture of Davidson Corp had always been designed to intimidate. A brutalist monolith of glass and steel that screamed of absolute, unyielding power. But as I stood on the newly inaugurated rooftop garden exactly 1 year after the board voted Margaret into oblivion, the building felt as though it were finally breathing. The scent of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and fresh rosemary rose to meet the morning sun, a verdant defiance against the smog of the city below. Where there once had been a helipad for executives fleeing the consequences of their greed, there was now a sprawling community sanctuary. It was a place of growth sitting atop a structure that had spent half a century dedicated to extraction. This garden was the living, breathing proof that even the most toxic soil can be reclaimed if the gardener is patient enough to wait for the storm to pass. The transition from Davidson Corp to Davidson Romano Corp was more than a rebranding. It was a public confession and a private victory. When the letters were hoisted onto the building's facade, bold brushed steel that caught the light, I had stood on the sidewalk with James and Claire, watching the name Romano take its place. It was the name of a woman who had been wheeled out of a side exit in shame. Now it was the name that anchored the city's most innovative conglomerate. We hadn't erased the Davidson name, though Margaret would have preferred us to. We kept it as a reminder of the foundation, but we added Romano as the soul. It was a testament to the fact that legacy isn't just what you inherit. It's what you forge when the world tries to leave you with nothing. The annual shareholders meeting held in the auditorium below had been a triumph of a different sort. Victoria hadn't just presented profits, she had presented a paradigm shift. She spoke of the triple bottom line: people, planet, and prosperity. She announced the expansion of the Romano Foundation, which now provided comprehensive childcare and legal advocacy for single parents navigating the same corporate minefields I had once crawled through. As she stood at the podium, her voice steady and her presence commanding, I saw the board members, the same men who had once looked at me with pity or disdain, leaning forward in genuine awe. She wasn't a child heir playing at business. She was a powerhouse leader who had turned a failing, corrupt dynasty into a beacon of ethical enterprise. After the meeting, Victoria found me on the rooftop, my fingers tracing the soft leaves of a sage plant. She had shed her blazer, her silk shirt billowing slightly in the high-altitude breeze. She looked at the city she now helped command, her eyes reflecting the gold of the setting sun. At 16, she possessed a gravity that most adults never achieve. She was a woman who knew exactly who she was because she had been forced to define herself in the absence of a father's validation. The audit for the Northern Basin is complete, Mom, she said, her voice carrying a quiet, resonant satisfaction. The water is clean. The fish are coming back. It cost us 12% of our projected quarterly growth to fix grandmother's mess, but the shareholders didn't even blink. They're finally realizing that you can't have a company if you don't have a world to put it in. I looked at her, and for a moment the rooftop vanished. I was back in that sterile hospital room, feeling the phantom sting of stitches and the cold weight of Alex's rejection. I remembered the sound of his shoes, the rhythmic execution, that I thought had ended my life. I looked at the daughter I had fought for, the miracle I had raised in a one-bedroom apartment with a laptop and a prayer, and a profound, luminous realization washed over me. Alex's rejection hadn't been the end of my story. It hadn't even been a detour. It was the prologue. It was the necessary, agonizing catalyst that had stripped away my dependence on a man who never would have allowed me to become this version of myself. If Alex had stayed, if he had been good enough, I would have lived a small, comfortable life in his shadow. I would have been a Davidson wife, a woman defined by the jewelry he bought her and the social circles he navigated. Because he walked away, I had to become the architect. Because he denied Victoria, she had to become the conqueror. His cowardice had been the whetstone that sharpened our strength into a diamond. He would be terrified of you, I whispered, stepping closer to her. Victoria smiled, a small, knowing expression that held no bitterness, only a vast, liberated clarity. He was terrified of us then, Mom. That's why he ran. He saw the fire in you even when you didn't, and he knew he couldn't control it. He didn't leave because we weren't enough. He left because he knew we were too much for a man who lived in a cage made of his mother's opinions. We stood together at the edge of the garden, looking out at the upward spiral of the city's skyline. Our journey hadn't been a circle. We hadn't returned to where we started. We had ascended. Every tear, every sleepless night, every client meeting where I had to prove I was twice as smart as the men in the room. It was all part of the ascent. We had taken the broken pieces of a betrayal and used them to build a lighthouse. The Romano-Davidson legacy was no longer a secret kept in a leather portfolio or a shame hidden in a manila envelope. It was a public victory. A story of what happens when a mother and daughter refuse to be the collateral damage of a powerful family's dysfunction. I watched Victoria point out a new sustainable development on the horizon, her mind already 3 moves ahead, planning the next phase of our expansion. I felt a peace so deep it felt like it reached back through time to that frightened girl in the hospital bed, whispering to her that the pain was just the labor of a much greater birth. I realized then that the most beautiful revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies. It's the total, undeniable irrelevance of them. Margaret was a forgotten name in a legal brief. Alex was a memory of a lesson learned. But we were the present. We were the future. We were the proof that common blood could build empires that the aristocracy could only dream of. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised gold, I pulled Victoria into a brief, fierce embrace. We had come full circle, but we were standing on a higher plane. I looked at the building, at the garden, and at the woman my daughter had become, and I finally understood the true nature of the journey. The hospital room hadn't been the end of my world. It had been the opening of the door. Some endings aren't endings at all. They are just beautiful beginnings in disguise. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching. It is an honor to share these journeys of justice and redemption with you. Diana's story is a testament to the fact that we are never truly broken. We are just being refined. If you found value in this tale, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters to us. And if you'd like to see more stories of strength and restoration, please subscribe to Queen's Revenge. Your support means the world to us. Remember, your story is just beginning.